but not in Tokyo. On hearing the news from Toronto, the commander-in-chief of Japan's combined fleet, Admiral Yamamoto, turns to his chief of staff and says, an air attack on Pearl Harbor might be possible now, especially as our air training has turned out so successfully. Spring 1941. The Japanese continue their aggression in Indochina and sign a war pact with Germany. Most of Europe is under the Nazi boot. Hitler is pleased with his new Japanese ally as he presides over the launch of Germany's newest, most formidable weapon, the battleship Bismarck. The ship is referred to as he, in deference both to its namesake, the great Prussian Chancellor, and the masculine warrior tasks for which it was created. On one speed trial in the Baltic, he reaches 30.8 knots. The ship boasts 8 15-inch guns and a sophisticated fire control system. Bismarck's armor consumes 40% of the ship's weight. The battleship is the perfect symbol for the Third Reich. And yet, Bismarck is far too valuable to place in harm's way. Its mission is to hunt enemy merchant ships, as do the other German raiders. On May 19, 1941, Bismarck steams to sea on its maiden voyage. Even before Hitler learns of its departure, the British are tracking Bismarck's progress. 4 days later, the battleship is located by the superior radar of the heavy cruiser Suffolk. Now the Royal Navy knows Bismarck is on the move, racing for the North Atlantic. HMS Hood and Prince of Wales are dispatched to intercept. By 5:45 on the morning of 24 May, the Hood and Prince of Wales have closed within 13 miles of Bismarck. Hood fires first. Bismarck immediately returns fire. The first shells strike the Hood's fused torpedoes at midships, and she explodes.
Battle was over in a matter of minutes. Hood blew in two, a huge explosion, witnessed in horror from Prince of Wales. Hood, going at 28 knots, the stern section virtually drove herself into the sea, and the bow section canted up. A final salvo was seen being fired from the foremost guns uselessly into the sky. In a few seconds, Hood was gone.
Of the ship's total company of 1,419, 3 survivors cling to life rafts in the icy water. Only one, Sigelman Ted Briggs, is alive today.
I felt myself being dragged down, and I was trying to get away. And the next thing I knew was I suddenly seemed to shoot to the surface. When I came up, there wasn't another soul inside. I looked around, and she was about 50 yards away, and she was vertical with the water. And the B turret was just going under. I panicked, and I turned and swam as fast as I could away from her. And when I looked around again, she'd gone. Those on the upper deck, a lot were killed and wounded before she went. And the others, I suppose, were just taken care of by suction. But only 3 of us came up. She was a beautiful, proud ship, but unfortunately with a glass jaw.
HMS Hood's glass jaw was a function of her design. Armor had been sacrificed for speed. The next day, the victorious Bismarck, a hole in its bow from a shell fired from Prince of Wales, is short on fuel and heads directly for France.
The Royal Navy had been utterly shocked at the loss of Hood. Ships right across the Atlantic converged towards the likely area of Bismarck, in some cases without orders. They had to find Bismarck. They were going to sink that ship, one way or another.
26 May, 1941, 10:30 a.m. A Catalina flying boat dives through the clouds for a better look at a huge ship below. It is met with a hail of gunfire from the Bismarck, trailing oil at 20 knots, less than 12 hours from freedom in France. But only 50 miles away is the British carrier Ark Royal. Within minutes, 15 of the Ark Royal's swordfish are in the air. Most of their torpedoes will miss, but one jams the Bismarck's rudder and plants the seeds of its destruction. Royal Navy battleships will finish the job.
Bismarck died under very severe bombardment while shot to pieces at close range. It was very bloody, and nearly 2,000 men died. It was a human tragedy. A very stout ship, slow death, hammered to pieces.
In less than half an hour, the greatest German warship of all time rolls over and sinks. The victim of 400 shells, 15 well-placed torpedoes, and British resolve to revenge the Hood. By the fall of 1945, after more than 6 years of the fiercest fighting the world has ever seen, all of Germany's battleships had been sunk, and Japan's monster battleship, her last hope for victory, is also at the bottom of the sea. World War II is over. The once mighty empire of Japan lies in ruin. President Harry Truman from Missouri prepares for peace.
I have received this afternoon a message from the Japanese government.
He has determined that the unconditional surrender of Japan will take place most symbolically upon the deck of the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay. The Americans have come back to Japan to anchor very near the spot where in 1853 Commodore Matthew Perry anchored to demand that the Japanese open their nation to the West. The events of the day will be carefully documented. 170 reporters, photographers, and radio soundmen swarm the decks of the USS Missouri to record sounds and images that will be seen around the world for years to come. To this day, the battleship Missouri remains the most historic of all American battleships. For naval historian and battleship veteran Paul Stilwell, the Missouri is an heroic symbol, for on her deck one era ended and another began.
And so it was on September 2nd, 1945, that General Douglas MacArthur came to this ladder at 9:01 on that Sunday morning while the Japanese were waiting for him to come down and accept the surrender of a proud but defeated nation. As the general walked forward, on his left was an American flag flown out from Annapolis for the ceremony. It had been on board Commodore Matthew Perry's flagship in Tokyo Bay in 1853. Farther to the left were dozens of American officers wearing khaki. The Japanese ahead of him were in top hats and morning coats. The Japanese looked up to this towering superstructure and saw hundreds of pairs of eyes boring down at them. There was an eerie silence on board the deck of the Missouri as General MacArthur came to the end of his walk. Standing just about here, his hand trembling slightly, at 9:02, he began a short speech looking beyond the war.
We are gathered here to conclude a solemn agreement.
At 9:04, Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu signed on behalf of the Japanese nation. Then the military representative. Then General MacArthur signed for the Allied powers. Finally, one by one, the representatives of the Allies came forward.
Whereby these proceedings are closed.
And so, on board a battleship, ended the greatest war in human history. Today, the Missouri remains the pinnacle of battleship design and technology. Still ready, it would seem, for another fight or yet another symbolic mission. On that infamous Sunday morning in 1941, Japan had sought to destroy every one of America's battleships in a single stroke. Yet here on the deck of a battleship, they surrendered without condition to the overwhelming force of the United States and her allies. The living symbol of that force remains the battleship Missouri. Missouri Captain Lee Case.
She is a ship with a heart and soul. And the soul of the ship has always been and always will be the past, present, and future sailors that serve on her.
In peace and war, the tradition of the American battleship sailor grew large, enhanced by competition of every kind. They were like rival schools, cheering on their own. Battleship sailors have long been a special breed, perhaps because of the extraordinary teamwork required to man the guns and fight the ship, or the special symbolic nature of a battleship, or simply because they knew they were aboard the Navy's best. Their ship became their home, and their home was a matter of pride. Between 1920 and 1941, America's fleet included up to 18 battleships that cruised the oceans of the world to train their crews and fly the flag. A powerful symbol that the American Navy was a genuine deterrent to any would-be aggressor. And among those pre-war American battleships was the USS North Carolina. Today, she rests as a state memorial in Wilmington, honoring the more than 10,000 North Carolinians who fought and died in World War II.
Welcome to the USS North Carolina.
A visit aboard the North Carolina is a visit back in time.
And as you begin it, let us tell you something about this giant of a ship. We should start by saying there have been three.
Here, some 2,500 men once lived and worked, and carried on the business of war in a city at sea. The North Carolina's engines could drive the ship at 27 knots, 6 knots faster than any previous American battleship. Here rest the 9 great guns of her main battery, fired 2,396 times in 9 operations by crews that often worked around the clock in the suffocating heat of the Pacific. Captain Dave Shoy is Executive Director of the North Carolina Memorial. He explains how the crew worked the guns.
This is the lower projectile flat from where the crew would take the chosen type of ammunition, be it the 2,700-pound armor-piercing or the 1,900-pound high-capacity projectile, and raise it up to the gun house to be placed in the barrel.
Each steel barrel weighs 96 tons and can be loaded in 30 seconds.
The first projectile is already in place to be raised up to the gun house. Once this projectile is clear, the next projectile is slid into place.
A full 9-gun broadside of armor-piercing projectiles delivers a total weight of 24,000 pounds and can penetrate more than 20 inches of the strongest hardened steel.
For every projectile, it takes 6 90-pound powder bags. The crews down here will take the bags out of the tanks, put them on the conveyor belt. From here, they're passed one at a time to the powder flat, and then 6 of them together are going to be raised up to the gun. The projectile, when the transfer tray lays down, is then rammed into the barrel. In the second phase, the first 3 bags of powder come out of the hoist and are separated, and then the second 3 bags are rolled into place. In the third phase, the 6 bags of powder would then be rammed into the barrel, the primer attached to the last powder bag, the breech closed, and the gun is ready to fire.
The shells are hurtled over 2,000 feet per second as the gun recoils on itself, a distance of 4 feet. At a range of nearly 20 miles with the guns at maximum elevation, the trajectory is 7 miles high and the projectile becomes an armor-piercing bomb. To hit a moving target from a ship which itself is moving, pitching, and rolling requires a complex system of fire control. Deep below deck is the North Carolina's plotting room and the ship's analog computers. These primitive yet rugged computers, called range keepers, and their electrical switchboards control the guns. A stream of information from directors high up in the superstructure is relayed into the controlling range keeper. The course and speed of the ship and of its target ship, wind direction and velocity, temperature of the powder and the air, type of projectile, time of flight, gun wear, velocity of the ocean current, and more. The gun is aimed not at the target, but where the target will be when the projectile gets there. Linked to the controlling range keeper is a gyroscopically operated device called the stable vertical. The guns actually remain stable and can be aimed with great accuracy while the ship rolls and pitches beneath them. The 5-inch guns were controlled by the same kind of computers or range keepers as the 16-inch guns, but loading was a manual operation. Dave Shoy.
The 5-inch gun uses a projectile and a single powder case, as opposed to the 16-inch gun, which uses a projectile and 6 powder bags. So it is simpler for the operators to load them out. They will lay the projectile and the powder bag in the tray and then ram the 2 pieces into the barrel. It takes about 47 sailors to fully man a 5-inch mount.
Today, visitors relive what it was like to serve aboard such a ship. In passageways and living spaces below the main deck, thousands of battleship sailors made their home in ships like the North Carolina. They slept and ate and worked and played and worked. The galley served up 3 meals a day and then some. There was a store and a post office, and on a battleship there was ice cream at the soda fountain. There was a newspaper, a tailor, and a cobbler, and always there were decks to polish. As night falls, the North Carolina looms large against the Wilmington skyline. Her great guns glow in the moonlight as she awaits yet another day to welcome her visitors, eager to know what it was once like aboard one of America's most decorated battleships. Although the North Carolina came home to stay, others would soon return to the battle line in defense of freedom. Sunday, 25 June 1950, 6 divisions of the North Korean Army, spearheaded by over 100 Soviet-built tanks, crossed the 38th parallel to invade South Korea. The United States, through the United Nations, is committed to defend South Korea. But what remains of America's once great battleships rests in mothballs. Only the Missouri, the last battleship commissioned by the United States Navy, is still at sea. Among her peaceful and symbolic missions, the Missouri traveled to South America and brought President Harry Truman home from an international conference in Rio de Janeiro in 1947. He and his family enjoyed life aboard the historic warship. He mixed with the crew, took walks, and actually waited in line at the barbershop. He admitted to being a first-time crosser of the equator and accepted his initiation as a pollywog and high spirits. From 1948 to 1950, the world's most famous battleship was at sea as a training ship. She was quickly ordered back to Norfolk to be loaded with supplies and live ammunition. The Missouri would be going back to work as a battleship. In time, she would be joined by her three sisters of the Iowa class, the Iowa, Wisconsin, and New Jersey. All four reactivated from mothballs for wartime duties to protect the fast carriers and bombard North Korean positions ashore. September 1950, the battleship Missouri has fought through two hurricanes, arriving too late for support of the American invasion at Incheon. Now, equipped with a helicopter for spotting, her big guns speak once again. Just before Christmas 1950, the Communist Chinese came into the war on the side of the North Koreans. 7 Chinese divisions converged on a single division of American Marines at Chosin Reservoir. The Marines fought their way to the tiny port city of Hungnam. The Missouri was there. Lee Royal was aboard.
We fired night and day.
Hungnam was in flames. The American Marines, along with North Korean civilians, their goats and chickens, had escaped. The last of the UN soldiers had set charges in the ammunition dump to keep it from the approaching Chinese. As the Missouri weighed anchor to leave the harbor, the earth shook with a gigantic explosion. While the Missouri was steaming in Korean waters, her sister ship, the New Jersey, was being recommissioned. By May, she was stationed off the North Korean port city of Kansong. At 5 in the morning of May 20, the guns of the New Jersey were fired in anger for the first time since 1945. After 6 months of operations off the coast of Korea, the New Jersey is relieved by her sister ship, the Wisconsin, and for 6 months in 1952 by the Iowa. Before the war is over, all 4 Iowa-class battleships will have seen action in Korean waters. After Korea, there were diplomatic cruises, training missions, and NATO maneuvers. But in November 1957, the Wisconsin completed her final cruise and followed her 3 Iowa-class sisters into the mothball fleet. For the first time since the 1890s, the United States was without even one active battleship. Throughout the first half of the politically charged 1960s, America became increasingly involved in a war in Southeast Asia. Perhaps a battleship could save American lives. But the battleships of the Iowa class slept in mothballs. Then, in 1967, the word came down: bring back the New Jersey. Within months, she would be guided into dry dock at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, where her great hull would leave the water for the first time in a decade. The men of the shipyard had done this job before, some of them when she was first built in the early 1940s. From scaffolding high in the superstructure and in spaces below, the men of the Philadelphia yard would bring the ship back to life, updating her electronics for the Navy of the 1960s. Finally, after nearly a year of work, the reborn New Jersey steams triumphantly to sea. On September 29, 1968, the world's only active battleship arrived off the coast of Da Nang, South Vietnam, ready for work. Captain of the New Jersey at the time was the colorful J. Edward Snyder.
The commanding officer of the field hospital said that he was taking incoming being the
the North Vietnamese were shelling his hospital while they were trying to do operations. And would I consider lobbing a shell over his hospital just for the heck of it to try to see if that would stop them? And I said, well, I'd be perfectly willing to do that. Let me take a look at what the situation is. And, of course, one of my officers said, you can't fire over your own troops. And I said, they're not troops, they're the hospital. He said, well, that's worse. I said, oh, shut up, we're going to do it anyhow. So we would stand up there and between the hours of 1 o'clock and 3 o'clock in the morning, fire randomly 2 shells directly over the hospital and have the explosion go several thousand yards over the hospital. And not one time during the 30 days we did that did the hospital take incoming from the Vietnamese.
Throughout her tour in Vietnam, the New Jersey was a constant object of attention from the press. On one occasion, a reporter approached Captain Snyder and asked about the ship's real effectiveness.
I said to him, well, why don't you ask the people we're supporting, for heaven's sakes? They're the people that know whether I'm effective or not, or whether the ship's effective. So he goes ashore, he comes back, and he shows it to me, and he plays me the tape. And the last line of the tape was, if it hadn't been for the Big J, they would have zapped our ass.
By June of 1969, the New Jersey was back home in friendly waters. And only 6 months later, on a damp and chilly day in Bremerton, Washington, an old story was being repeated once again. For the second time, the New Jersey had been consigned to the mothball fleet. Her new captain, Robert Penniston, voiced the feelings of many when he said, "The hour cometh, and now is to say farewell. Rest well, yet sleep lightly, and hear the call." Then in the fall of 1979, Iranian militants seized America's embassy in Tehran. The Soviets invaded Afghanistan, and the United States was perceived by some as weak, unwilling, or unable to act. But by 1981, America had a new president, and Ronald Reagan's Secretary of the Navy, John Lehman, had new ideas to build an enlarged fleet organized around aircraft carriers and recommissioned Iowa-class battleships. By summer, President Reagan had signed the new defense legislation, and all 4 of the Iowa-class ships were on their way back. They would be transformed, modernized with the very latest of weaponry. No longer would their offensive action be limited to the range of their historic 16-inch guns. 8 box launchers for 32 Tomahawk cruise missiles with a range of 1,500 miles, and 4 quadruple canister launchers for 16 close-in Harpoon anti-ship missiles were mounted in the superstructures. 4 Vulcan Phalanx weapon systems would provide defense against enemy aircraft and incoming missiles. New communication systems, air search radar, and improved living spaces equipped the Iowas for the 1980s. To replace and refit what was required of the original equipment, no longer manufactured, the Navy secured tons of items from America's museum battleships, the North Carolina, Alabama, and Massachusetts. The 1982 recommissioning of the New Jersey cost $326 million. More than 3 times what it cost to build her in 1941. But to Secretary Lehman, intent on creating a new Navy, symbolic of America's status as a world power, she was more than worth it. By 1983, the New Jersey is bright and new once again. She cruises as the centerpiece of a new battle group. For 6 months, she cruises the coast and shells Syrian gun positions ashore. In time, she is joined at sea by the USS Iowa and her sister ships, Missouri and Wisconsin.
Austin, what do you have on Skunk about 5 degrees off the port bow?
Yes, sir. It's Skunk India, bearing 255, 21,000. Course 075.
Evaluator, I have an update on the Kinda.
Very well.
All stations report, ready to call for fire.
All stations report, ready to call for fire.
Report, ready to call for fire.
On a routine training mission in the spring of 1989, as the crew of the Iowa prepares to fire the center 16-inch gun in number 2 turret, something goes terribly wrong. 47 sailors are killed in a tragedy that to this day has not been fully explained. And as the Cold War comes to an end the next year, the Iowa and her sister, the New Jersey, are again to be decommissioned. Only the Wisconsin and Missouri continue to cruise and train with the modern Navy, flying the flag, awaiting the day when they too will be returned to mothballs, sold as scrap, or converted as museums. No one yet realized that America's two remaining battleships would soon fight their third war, perhaps their final war. In Operation Desert Storm, the battleship was once again an integral part of the American strike force. From their decks, Tomahawk cruise missiles were launched at targets up to 800 miles away in Iraq and Kuwait. They were so accurate and destructive that eventually the coalition ran out of targets. No hostile fire ever reached the battleships. The relentless bombardment from their 16-inch guns helped pave the way as the troops of the coalition entered Kuwait City unopposed. And all the while, the battleship sailors aboard their ships watched their success, as did the rest of the world. The forces of the coalition declared victory on February 28th. During the final days of the land war, the men of the Missouri had performed for 4 straight days without sleep in the best tradition of the battleship sailor, Lee Case.
Sailors on other ships are always watching sailors on battleships. They're trying to emulate them. They would like to be there in their place. They know that they're in a position where they're always on display. And the sailors on board a battleship have to carry out the tasks that they're assigned to do, but they have to do them better than the rest of the fleet, and therefore they're always 6 inches taller than the rest of them.
On the 6th of March, the Wisconsin departs the Persian Gulf. The Missouri heads for home on the 21st. They will sail into a post-Cold War world of military downsizing and critics who still remember the tragic explosion aboard the Iowa. By September, the Wisconsin has been decommissioned, and the Missouri's days are growing shorter. But she will make one last symbolic and ceremonial voyage. She is going back to observe the anniversary of the event that plunged America into World War II. Paul Stilwell.
One morning in early December 1991, it was my privilege to be here on board the battleship Missouri as she steamed in the Pearl Harbor Channel for the last time. As we went in on the port side were the mooring quays where the battleships had been in December 1941 when the Japanese attacked. And in my mind's eye, I could see the smoke and the flame billowing up where hundreds of American sailors were killed.
The past and present intertwine in the memories of young and old. 50 years ago to the day, their thoughts float back to that Sunday morning when many thought the era of the battleship had come to an end. For the Missouri, symbol of all the great battleships of the Second World War, it has been a journey back in time. The next chapter in her long life can now begin. March 31, 1992, the Long Beach Naval Shipyard. Her equipment inactivated, her compartment stripped of every usable item. The world's last active battleship is to be decommissioned. Now she seems but a symbol of past glories, the last of her breed of thoroughbreds. For 100 years, they changed the world into which they had been born. Dreadnought began an arms race that never seemed to cease. To this day, major powers still seek the ultimate weapon. For the first 50 years of its life, the battleship was that weapon, the nuclear weapon of her day. Now, one by one, America's last battleships have been retired, fitting memorials to the thousands who died in war. Texas, Massachusetts, Alabama, North Carolina. And now the Missouri is in receipt of her final orders. Her guns silenced, her system shut down. She will pass from history into legend and take her place moored near the battleship Arizona as a memorial in Pearl Harbor. Two great warships that mark the beginning and the end of the greatest conflict in human history. Missouri, her name officially stricken from the Register of American Naval Vessels, awaits her fate. The Bugle no longer calls her crew to quarters. And yet on those days when the sun glistens on her great guns and the wind whistles down her decks, the ghosts of another time would still seem to speak the question: is this not the great dreadnought of 3 wars, a peacetime symbol of power the world over? Were not her weapons the finest in the world? And did they not speak peace as well as war? For 50 years, the symbol of American naval power. The battleship. For a century, its guns spoke for the great nations of the world. Instruments of death and destruction, mighty symbols of national strength and resolve. The battleship, a warrior for all time.